Well, it's been a quiet week in Lake Wobegon, my hometown, out there on the prairie. It was Halloween on Monday night, and absolutely nothing happened in my town, and people have been talking about it ever since, wondering what is wrong with our children. There were a lot of kids out trick-or-treating, of course, and there was an official party up at the high school in the gym, and kids dressed up for that. And there were chaperones who were waiting around for something to happen, and nothing did. And there was another party at the Lutheran church, and nothing happened. Nobody did anything. Gary and Leroy, the town constables, were cruising around town so as to make it more of a challenge, for young people to lend a little excitement to the sport of Halloween. And nobody did anything. Nobody took anybody's garden tractor apart and reassembled it on the roof of their shed, and nobody went to the school and broke in and turned everything upside down, the desks and the pictures and everything, the way they used to. It was very bewildering to people. What's wrong with our children that they don't have the wit to use this one official opportunity for vandalism and rebellion? Halloween is a great holiday. It's the night when young people are given permission to play tricks with the knowledge that you are responsible for what you do. And it's funny if nobody gets hurt. And if somebody does get hurt, then it's not funny anymore. And you're responsible even if it's not your fault, which is an important thing to learn when you are young. It was a few years ago that Mr. Berge was celebrating Halloween in the Sidetrack Tap, as is his custom. And several high school boys went out to Hanson's with their van, and they went out to the pen behind the barn, and they got 6 big white geese. They stuffed them in gunny sacks, and they drove them back into town, and they pried Mr. Berge's trunk open. And somehow they stuffed all 6 of these geese in the trunk. And then they went across the street and they waited. He came out in a little while and he heard the commotion in his trunk. But he thought that if he just opened the trunk carefully, he'd be able to keep control of the situation. But he opened it up just a crack, and those 6 geese just came boiling out of there. They just blew out of that trunk. They knocked the poor man over on his can, and they took off across town, flapping and sailing around and honking and attacking little children who were going around in the dark trick-or-treating. Suddenly to have a goose come at you out of the dark. Years from now, in dim rooms across America, there will be psychiatrists who will patiently try to lead their patient's memory back to that terrible evening when this horrible thing occurred to them that knocked their lives off the rails and led them into lives of bitterness and anger and frustration. Will try to lead them back to that moment when this ghastly apparition came at them. Huge avenging angels came down from the trees at them and honked at them and drove them screaming home. This may have caused harm to somebody. And if it does, you, the comedian, are responsible, though you were helpless to prevent it. This is the value of Halloween. So that if you think it would be funny, and it might be hilarious to let the cattle out of the pens, and they would go wandering into town and cause a big commotion, and Gary and Leroy would have to round up people and round up all these cattle, and it would take all night, and it would be a terrific trick. When those cattle are let out of those pens by you and your high school friends, you are now responsible for whatever they do. And if they don't go the way that you want them to towards town, but instead they wander out onto the train tracks and they become confused, and they stand out there milling around on the rails, and the fast train comes from Chicago and plows into those cattle, and people on the train are injured, and there is a bloody mess that takes days and days to clean up. You and your friends are going to have some very difficult weeks ahead of you. You are going to be brought in by the police and sat down under fluorescent lights, and they will make it clear to you that this is no longer humorous at all. The police will put real fear into you, and if you're cool about it, they'll bear down until they see fear. There'll be talk about jail terms for this. And your parents will come along, and your parents are going to have to dish out an awful lot of money to pay for those cattle. And things are going to be very tense around your home for a while. It doesn't mean you shouldn't let the cattle out of the pen. Just know that this is a town that believes in outcome-based morality. So don't tell the cops about whose idea it was. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. And don't tell them what you intended to happen. It doesn't matter at all. You're responsible, even though it's not your fault. Halloween was the time of year back in my father's day. Not that my father was involved in this, but there was a time back in my father's day when young men would go around Lake Wobegon and they would tip over privies, which was a great sport. Outhouses, outdoor toilets lasted a long time in Lake Wobegon because for my people, moving your bowels or relieving your bladder was such an intimate and private act that they wanted to go off a little ways and do it. They didn't just want to go into the next room. They wanted to walk out across the yard and out back and go into a little shed by themselves and do this. Now, the boys would hide up in the weeds by the Lutheran church, which was up in the better part of town, and from the weeds, they could see the backyards of the newspaper editor and the banker, old Mr. Inkvist, and they could see the backyard of the pastor. And they would wait for one of these great men to come out back. Now, of course, these great men knew that it was Halloween. So they avoided going out back. But at last it became inevitable. And the great man came out the back door of his house, oftentimes carrying a shotgun and a lantern with him. The lantern made him feel safer, but of course it made him easy to spot. And when he went into the little house, the boys would creep forward, but they would still lie low in the weeds because they knew he was wary in there. He was on red alert, sitting in there on his little seat. He was looking out the knotholes of the outhouse, and he was listening very carefully for any sounds in the grass. And ever so often, he would just kick the door open and say, "Okay, I know you're out there." But of course, he had to relax in order to do what he went there to do. When they heard the sounds that indicated relaxation, they moved in swiftly from the rear, and they tipped it forward onto the door. And the great man, at the moment of his happiness and his greatest vulnerability, felt his world suddenly tip and everything topple, and he fell forward and landed on all fours on his hands and knees with his trousers down around his ankles. And they got to hear him kneel in there and curse them. And that, of course, was the payoff. To hear some old Lutheran express himself when he really had something to say. And do it with great enthusiasm and inventive profanity. And now, of course, the door was closed. He couldn't get this thing off it. And the only exit was back through the hole in the seat, which, of course, led him in a direction he did not care to go. The newspaper editor back in 1920 on Halloween night, Valdemar Starr, was sitting in his privy and was tipped forward, and when it tipped forward, the lantern fell and it broke, and 2 bottles of Canadian whiskey that he kept up in the rafters came crashing down, and they broke, and flames went halfway up the side. That old man dove out through the seat in the bench. He went headfirst into the latrine. And a week later, he came out against Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations with a vehemence that was awfully hard on us Democrats, I must say. And some of us have not recovered from it since. No, it was a great stimulus to indoor plumbing, Halloween. And technology was hard on Halloween. There were things you could do with cars back in the old days that you can't do anymore. They used to be able to hook up a spark plug to the tailpipe and put a little switch there onto the dashboard on this wire, and then you'd rev up your engine real hard and then take your foot off the gas, and a lot of unburned gasoline would go blowing out the tailpipe, and then they'd flick that switch and flames would shoot out 6 feet behind the car. Thanks to pollution control, that unburned gasoline doesn't come out the tailpipe anymore, and so this great trick has taken out of our hands. Clarence Bunsen once, for Halloween, hooked up a wire from his coil in his engine and back into the car and into a loop of wire that he threaded into the cushion of the back seat. And he went out on Halloween night with Arlene, whom he was not yet married to, and her brother Bob and Bob's date Evelyn. And they parked up on the hill up behind the high school. Now, Clarence owed Bob one. Bob was a great practical joker, and he had once put 15 sheep into Clarence's bedroom, which took Clarence about 3 or 4 days to clear out this problem. So Bob and Evelyn sat in the back seat, and they talked in the dark. And Bob said, "How much did you pay for this car?" It was a 48 Ford. Clarence said, "I got this car for $20. "Really?" Bob said. "That cheap?" "Oh, yeah," Clarence said. "They really wanted to get rid of it. They were awfully anxious to get rid of this car." "Yeah, because the people who sold it to me said that this car was haunted." Now, I don't have any experience of that myself. I've never seen a ghost in this car, but I guess it's a fact that this car belonged to some people who were parked in it. They were young, and there were 2 couples, one in the back seat, one in the front seat, and they were parked out near Millet late one night, and they were necking there in the dark. It was a summer night, and a hobo came tiptoeing up through the weeds, and he stood by the rear window, right back there where you're sitting. He stood by the rear window watching. And the girl who was sitting right there where you are, Bob, she just turned and she saw him out of the corner of her eye. His grizzled old face was 3 inches away from hers. And she sat up straight and she opened her mouth and she died of a heart attack right there. Now, the boy who was with her leaped out of the car, and he chased that hobo down into the weeds and back in the trees. And the other hobos who were down there, they caught him and they beat him up and they killed him with logs. And they say that it's his ghost that's back there in the back seat, though I don't have any experience of it myself. I've never been aware of it. But There was one thing they told me that was pretty strange. I'm not sure whether to believe this or not. And right then, as Bob and Evelyn were leaning forward, breathless, Clarence flicked the switch under his dash, and 20,000 volts went through the back seat. And the two of them leaped up. They hit the ceiling. Bob was suddenly about 50 yards way out that way. Evelyn ruined her best clothes. She left town. She never spoke to them after that. It took years before Bob was able to relax around Clarence to the point where they could carry on a conversation. That's what Halloween used to be like. But now it's kind of all passed away. It was back in the late 30s, I think, that a gang of about 40 boys got together on Halloween, and they went down to the train station, and they pushed a boxcar out onto a grade crossing, which took a lot of effort. They pushed it out there on the crossing, knowing that they were responsible for whatever happened. They rolled it, and it was like pushing a building at first, and then it began to roll, and it moved out into the bright lights where anybody could see them, but nobody did. They pushed it out onto the grade crossing, and then it picked up speed, and it pulled away, and it kept going, and they knew they were responsible for this boxcar. And they jumped into a pickup truck, and they took off after that boxcar, driving right down the rails. They had never driven on railroad ties before. And the pickup truck shook like God was using it for a maraca. It just went up and down so hard that it made your jaws flap. It made your teeth hurt. But as fast as they could go, they couldn't catch up to that boxcar, and it disappeared around a curve, and they didn't see it, and they kept going. They were terrified what would happen to it. It was picking up speed, and then they heard the whistle of the North Coast Limited, and they pulled on that steering wheel as hard as they could, and it was hard to get the front tires of that pickup truck up over the rail, but finally they got it over the rail, and it went down a slope and into a swamp just as the North Coast Limited went by. Shoo! The North Coast Limited was going west, and the boxcar had been heading east. They had been heading east. The North Coast Limited came toward them, and there was no sign of the boxcar. The next day, the station master said it had contained 3 pianos and 15 sofas. They never found it. It never showed up, that boxcar. Years later, one of the boys who pushed that boxcar was out deer hunting. And about a half mile away from the tracks, out in the woods, he heard music. He heard a piano playing in the distance, and he followed the sound. It was a tune that his mother had played when he was a boy. And he came to a clearing, and there was an old green sofa sitting there in the weeds. It was full of mice, had been there for years. And when he sat down on it, he couldn't hear the music anymore. He thought about his mother. So many questions he wished he had asked her. But now she was dead, of course. And he had no idea who she was or where they had come from. No idea whatsoever. She was vanished with all of their family history, gone into the night, like a boxcar, sailing along full of pianos and sofas, never to be seen again. That's the news from Lake Wobegon. Where all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average.